Justice Sotomayor with Ketanji Brown Jackson in this case we're going to talk about. The majority of the Supreme Court is being basically called out as sellouts who are willing to take the phone call of Donald Trump at any point in time in the middle of the night. They're getting slammed like I've never seen slammed before. In a democracy, power implies responsibility. The greater the power that defies law, the less tolerant can this court be of defiance. Today's order clarifies only one thing. Other litigants must follow the rules, but the administration has the Supreme Court on speed dial. Respectfully, I dissent.
What happens when the Supreme Court becomes a personal concierge for a president? Justice Sotomayor's fiery dissent has people questioning if but equal justice for all is more like but special privileges for some. Stay tuned, because her takedown was brutal. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So did you click the subscribe button? Great, thank you so much. Now, back to the video. Imagine calling 911 to order a pizza. That's how Trump treated the Supreme Court, except in this case, the court actually delivered, and not just once. The Trump administration filed so many emergency relief requests during his term that it made other presidents look like they'd been asleep at the wheel.
This case was something that you and I spoke about before, although this ruling is an update to that, where a district court in Massachusetts stayed these 8 migrants. You know, these 8 people, if they go to Libya, we probably will never see them again. They may suffer irreparable harm. So let's just make sure before we do third country deportations. And they were stuck in Djibouti in transit because the stay order happened. And the stay order by the district court's like, hey, just chill. Let's figure this out. There were a lot of rights that are being impacted.
He didn't just break records, he obliterated them. In just a few months, Trump handed in more emergency motions than Obama and Biden did in all 8 years of their presidencies combined. But here's the kicker. The Supreme Court granted a shocking number of them, often without giving full detailed explanations. Legal experts were left scratching their heads, and Justice Sotomayor, well, she wasn't scratching hers, she was sharpening it for a dissent. And this wasn't just business as usual for the court. A lot of these requests bypassed the standard process using what's called the shadow docket. Sounds ominous, right? Well, it kind of is. The shadow docket allows the court to make decisions quickly, without oral arguments or the usual transparency. Think of it as the Supreme Court's fast lane, where rulings are handed out like candy. This process is supposed to be for emergencies, but Trump's team treated it like a buy one get one free coupon, filing emergency requests like it was their second job.
The Supreme Court basically ruled in the shadow docket, you can do that, you can do that. But then they had to confront another issue. Well, if you can do that, then aren't you giving Donald Trump permission to fire the chairman of the Federal Reserve? You would read that as seeming to have the same types of protections for the NLRB and the Merit Protections Board as you would for the Federal Reserve. I don't think anyone would be like, oh, the Federal Reserve is so different. But that's what the Supreme Court ruled. Then you go, well, why did they rule that way? So they make this bizarre compromise in their mind. Let me be clear when I say they. The right-wing Supreme Court justices, the liberal justices, hated this ruling.
The lack of scrutiny meant that rulings were often rushed, and explanations were either light on detail or non-existent. The whole thing became so lopsided that it felt less like a court of law and more like a fast food drive-thru. Trump's legal team rolled up to the Supreme Court window, barked out an order, and like magic, they'd have their requests hot and ready. Need a travel ban enforced? Sure thing. Want immigration rules bent in your favor? Coming right up. The sheer speed and frequency of these decisions made it seem like the court was prioritizing the administration's convenience over fairness and due process.
Respondents, Gwen Wilcox, NLRB, Kathy Harris, Merit System Boards, they contend that the arguments in this case necessarily implicate the constitutionality of for-cause removal protections. The Federal Reserve is uniquely structured quasi-private entity that follows in the distinct historical tradition of the first and second banks of the United States. And that's all throughout their jurisprudence now. Second Amendment, this, that. Let's take a look at the distinct historical tradition, and then they go back and divine the way they view history.
Here's the takeaway. The Supreme Court wasn't just reacting to emergencies. It was catering to one guy on speed dial. And you won't believe which case finally made Sotomayor slam the brakes. What kind of case could compel a Supreme Court justice to write a dissent so sharp it feels like a punch? For Justice Sotomayor, it was the deportation of 8 migrants, each desperately fighting not to be sent back to Libya, a country currently synonymous with chaos and danger. These individuals weren't just looking for a better life, they were clinging to survival. A federal district court in Massachusetts had initially put a freeze on their deportations, arguing that proper legal procedures needed to be followed before sending anyone to a situation that could cost them their lives. Makes sense, right? You'd think due process would be the bare minimum. Apparently not to the Supreme Court. The district court's pause wasn't good enough for the Trump administration, which wanted to rush through the deportation like it was their latest reality TV deadline. Trump's team brought the case to the Supremes, and in another late-night shadow docket move, the majority sided with the administration. No oral arguments, no detailed reasoning, just a green light to begin loading people onto planes, potentially to face a nightmare.
The Supreme Court makes the most awful rulings, Harry, but they do also recognize that Trump is a complete madman. So there's this tension between them wanting to just be the most horrible right-wing court imaginable. Basically gave Donald Trump a blank check or full permission to what we always thought would be unlawful, to fire any chairperson or committee person on these independent agencies. The other is Kathy Harris from the Merit Systems Protection Board. We always viewed that if you wanted to fire people like that, it's got to be for cause, not just for any reason. Trump fired them just because, not for cause.
Think about what they were being sent back to, a country torn apart by violence, with reports suggesting that migrants deported to Libya often end up in concentration camps, not metaphorical ones, actual camps where torture and exploitation aren't the exception, they're the rule. The Massachusetts District Court had paused the deportations for good reason, warning of grave harm if they went through without a proper review. But the Supreme Court brushed aside those warnings like crumbs off a table, rushing to please the executive branch instead of double-checking the justice of the situation. That's what lit Sotomayor's fuse. Her dissent was a scathing rebuke, blasting the court for ditching their responsibility and choosing power over fairness. She drove the point home with a line that deserves its own t-shirt. In a democracy, power implies responsibility. A dig at Trump? Maybe. A dig at the court bending over backward to help him? Absolutely. This wasn't just one bad decision. It exposed a system where justice might depend on who's asking for it. What happens when the court stops holding power accountable and starts collaborating with it? Let's talk about that. The Supreme Court's willingness to fast-track Trump's demands didn't just influence one presidency, it set a dangerous precedent. If the highest court throws transparency out the window, who's left to keep power in check? Justice Sotomayor's dissent, joined by Justice Jackson, wasn't just a critique, it was a warning shot. By calling out the court's inversion of legal principles, they reminded everyone that dissent is essential, even if the odds are stacked. It's a flicker of hope that not everyone in the system is willing to rubber stamp abuse. The question is, will those voices be enough to steer us back?